So the word legacy, the blessings of our forefathers and mothers, and the sins of our forefathers and mothers. We are blessed with a legacy, right? Those that came before us. Very few of us can remember our great-great-grandparents, right? Even less our great-great-great-grandparents. But the legacy that they have that came before us is important, even if unknown. As we think about Juneteenth, the legacy, the horrible legacy in our own country and in many other countries of slavery. It's a legacy that some want to deny. Some don't want us to feel bad about it. Some don't want us to remember it. Some don't want us to know that it still exists in other forms. But if we think about that legacy, it's a legacy that we all own. And we'll talk a little bit about that later. It's a legacy that we own. We all own this legacy. If we don't own it, we will never get better by it. And that's legacy. It's our response to what happened. Okay, I need you to help me out, okay? This is not a test, okay? But, and James, this is going to be a little bit harder for you since your dad is right next to you, okay? But I want you to hold up your hands, okay? And if your dad was a 10 in your life, you just put up things. If he was a 5, if he was a 0, whatever number your dad was in your life, this will help me with the sermon today. All right, so just put up your hands if you considered your dad was a 10, a 5, a 7, a 2. James, you have no choice, right? You're sitting right next to your dad. Yeah, I get it. Okay, all right. And okay. Whether it was a 0 or a 10, the legacy is yours, and we learn from those legacies. You know, for some of us, the story of fatherhood, as Unitarian Ryan Urey tells us, was about love, acceptance, and guidance. But for others, it was about rejection, abuse, shame, or abandonment. For some, it was a story of nurturing. For others, it was marked by frustration and resentment, a story of burdens and unrealized dreams. For some, fatherhood is the longing for children, unborn or lost to death or estrangement. And some of us have no father story at all. The legacy is what we have done with the story that was given to us. The story that was given to us is not under our control. The chapter we write is under our control. And so when I think of our experiences, in the words of the Stoics, this is the hand we were dealt, and without judgment, we are responsible for taking that hand and doing our best. So we let our experience be what it is without measuring it against false ideals. As we think about the concept of mother and father, as Kathleen McKenzie shared in her sermon with me on Mother's Day, we need to go before our fathers and our mothers to parents, grandparents, and long before them. We can fully celebrate the legacy of our forefathers and foremothers if we understand it as not good or bad, but just as it was or is. They are the gifts, they are the sins that we are given. And to be fair, it's usually a mix of both. It just lets us know that our legacy for the next generation is probably going to be a mixed bag, right? When I was doing counseling, my advice to parents was, and is, don't worry so much about whatever decision you make regarding your children. Whether you're too liberal, too controlling, too intrusive, not intrusive enough. Whatever you decide, they're going to blame you when they're in therapy. So you just do your best. And it's true. We try to do our best, and it never seems to be good enough. But good enough it is. We've got some parents, dads here, got some kids here out in the nursery. We know it's hard. One of my favorite singers and poets is Bruce Springsteen, a Jersey homeboy. I had the opportunity to see him perform long before he became famous at the Jersey Shore. And that's what we call it in New Jersey. It's not the beach, it's the Jersey Shore. And at 16 years old, he left his home, and he lived on couches of friends and in his car. His dad was very abusive, not physically to his mother, but emotionally to him, his mother, and his sister. As an alcoholic with an undiagnosed and untreated psychological problems, life at home was hell for Bruce, his mom, and his younger sister. And his mom, with her strong Catholic faith, refused to leave him and wouldn't get a divorce. Fast forward, years later, Bruce's dad had stopped drinking, went into psychiatric treatment, and became a completely different person. He doted on Bruce's kids. Bruce's grandchildren literally thought their grandfather was a saint. I read Bruce's autobiography shortly after my dad's death, and what Bruce said about his dad and all dads was very poignant to me. He said, "Honor the good that your dad gave you and let go of all of the rest." Powerful, but not easy. Honor the good and let go of all of the rest. And isn't that what we would want our children, our mentees, our nieces and nephews and friends to do with our legacy? There's a saying that the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. But turn that around. We can also say that the tree does not grow very far from the apple, right? Think of it that way. In other words, we are connected both ways. We influence our forebears as they influence us. We change our grandparents and our parents. We change siblings. And sometimes we don't change them, but we have an influence. In this world where some of our family members are at extreme positions politically, religiously, socially, economically from us, we make a mark on them, even if they won't admit it. And they make a mark on us. In other words, sometimes it's an uncle or an aunt that changes. Acceptance of a gay, lesbian, or transgender niece or nephew. Acceptance of interracial partnerships and biracial children. A generation ago, these were big issues, right? If you go to a high school, the kids literally don't care. It is not an issue. And I will tell you, my kids will laugh about it, but in athletics and in other things, it makes no difference. You are competing like anyone else. And our generation of youth today is changing the generations before them. Their parents may not accept everything, but they do acknowledge it. They see their kids changing. I know my daughter changed my mom for the better in her acceptance of my daughter's beliefs, values, and way of life. Now, my own mom broke rules in her own upbringing. She died when she was 93. She played basketball competitively on a girls' high school team and a community league, various community leagues in Connecticut, which, by the way, was illegal in many other states, southern states and Midwestern states, for girls to play sports in high school. Didn't exist. My grandmother on my mother's side had an arranged marriage. She came from Poland at 16, and she said she lived the best years of her life until she was 21. And they sent the guy that was going to be her husband to her. And as a prearranged marriage, he arrived from Poland, married her, turned out to be an alcoholic and undependable, but fathered 6 children with her. So the legacy was very difficult for my grandma. But the legacy was also the 6 children. When my mom wanted to marry my father, my grandmother was opposed to the marriage because he was not Polish. Now, you can appreciate this, but my mom talked to her grandmother, and she responded in Polish. She had very limited English, but she said, he's not part of the family. In other words, he's not Polish. My mom, with Al in front, responded in English, if you don't let me marry Al, I'm going to go find me a Protestant. And in those days, that made a difference for a Catholic Polish family. So my dad got in, and we had 5 kids, including me. My dad served in World War II, and if you ever saw the movie about Saving Private Ryan, trying to bring home the remaining son alive from the family, my dad and all 5 of his brothers and 2 of his brothers-in-laws were all on active duty at the same time, short time at the end of World War II. My dad was sent to the Philippines one day after his 18th birthday, and fortunately, he said the war ended before he had to land on the beach, because he said we would have had the same mother, but we most likely would not have had the same father, because it would have been a brutal battle. So what would my legacy have been if I had had a different father? My grandmother was 46 years old when she had my mom, and back in that day, that was old. Embarrassed to be pregnant at that age, to an alcoholic father who was seldom home, she told no one. When my mom's older sister came home from work, just coincidentally, and stopped by the house, she met my mom, who had been born that afternoon in the house, not knowing at all that she was going to have a younger sister, and she was 21 at the time. What would my legacy have been with a different mother if my grandmother hadn't given birth at 46? Now, my mom spent most of her life working to take care of my mom, who still spoke little English, and my dad was the 10th out of 11 children, and his mom died of breast cancer when he was 5 years old. And his dad left the house every Monday during the Depression and came back on Friday. He was selling wares for the Fuller Brush Company, for those that you remember that. And he had great customers who would always try to buy something. So the older sisters were in charge, but really my dad and his brothers essentially raised themselves. So I always say the legacy of good parenting was not one that either one of my parents actually had. They were not raised with good role models. So having 5 children of their own, they did the best they could, loved us, but often fell short, as many of you know, in your own family. So what does that mean for the legacy that I had with my grandma, who spoke very little English, but cared for me for the first years of my life, till I went on to school? Now, I only remember perfect communication. When I needed something, I got it. I spoke English. She must have spoke Polish. I don't know. And but I would say that what she did, she played cowboys and Indians, soldiers and dinosaurs, and cars with me for endless hours. And I think my mom says those experiences kept her young. And I was truly the apple, and she was truly the tree. And it's interesting because I did not conscientize that phrase at the time, but one of the gifts that I got after my grandma died was a plastic apple tree with apples on the bottom. And so even back then, although it's ironic, you look at your family tree and look at our spiritual family tree, why we're here today. It's very important for us to think about that. All right, in the case of my family and Kelly's family, our parents and all of their siblings were all uniformly Catholics, raised in the Catholic Church, died in the Catholic Church. But I will tell you, all Catholics are not the same. They all stayed within their faith, but some had many more questions about their faith than others. But one generation later, my siblings and their spouses include Catholics, Eastern Rite Ukrainian Orthodox, Jewish, Nature-centered, and Unitarian Universalists. Kelly's siblings added Baptists, Episcopalians, Jewish and independent Christians. A complete change, but the legacy of a spiritual base from nature-centered to orthodox faiths was one that we all had. That was the legacy. Now, those of you who have left the Catholic Church officially understand that mothers are okay with that because you've had infant baptism. So no matter what you do, you're going to be okay. However, my folks were not surprised. They had visited this church a number of times for functions with Kelly and I. My dad read the principles, and he appreciated the openness of the church. But being a fairly Orthodox Catholic, his response was, I don't think this would be the right church for me. And I responded affirmatively, saying, I think you're in the exact place you need to be, Dad. But I would say the response that I got was truly the most adult response a father could give, right? It was non-judgmental, no shaming, just a reflection on himself. It was a beautiful moment. And the legacy that the faith that I grew up with, just like all of us, left me richer. I took and kept with me, like most of us do, a piece of our legacy, of our faith upbringing. And some of us, our faith upbringing was very secular. Some of it was non-existent. We went to our friends, friends took us to a church because our parents didn't go. In the Catholic Church, the corporal works of mercy, which we practice here, and Methodists, everybody does, feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, caring for the widow and the child, continues in my life, while other parts have been left behind. So our legacy, with all of its imperfections, is truly a gift, right? It's a gift that we have. You too have forefathers who struggled to do their best. Those that were forced to be here, and Juneteenth celebrates that. Not only celebrates that they were forced to be here as African Americans, but they were also forced to stay as long as the governments would keep them in bondage. And it took the U.S. military forces to go to Texas to tell the black men and women that they were free. This is the imperfections we have. So those who were immigrants to America, fought oppression, depression, alcohol abuse, for some of us even slavery or slave ownership, who worked hard, often in jobs we, this generation, might never do, to create futures for us, for our children, grandchildren, and of course generations removed, people that we will never know about. How we got here, who came on the boat, who came on the ship, who flew in, why we're here and not in some other country. What does our membership as Unitarian Universalists mean about the legacy of our forefathers and foremothers? I think of Len Shadd, whose grandfather was one of the founders of this church here. So he was a Unitarian at the time. The churches hadn't merged. Okay, raise your hand if you have a legacy of someone that was a Unitarian Universalist. Len, I know you're going to, okay, 2, 3. Okay, now put those hands down. Raise your hand if you don't have a legacy. That's pretty much the rest of us. Okay, raise your hand if you're not paying attention. Okay, good. All right, so we're good there. All right, so the legacy is that we've come to this place for a reason. The legacy is something that what I see I understand that legacy a little bit when things really get me seething, okay? Like really get me going. Like my anger thing ticks up. So when the Secretary of Defense, and I'll continue to call it Defense, Pete Hegseth said, quote, "No more dudes in dresses. We're done with that shit." As he tried and still continues to try to dehumanize our patriotic transgender troops. It just makes me seethe. When our president is proposing to give $300 billion to help restore and repair in Iran. And yet, we can't give our most vulnerable here in the United States the health insurance they need and the nutritional food they need to survive. I wonder, what beyond making rich even richer does make America great really mean? It just makes me angry. And then I think of, what does that relate to? Why? There's a legacy there. There's a reason. Did these feelings just come up by myself or ourselves, or do they have roots that we should be aware of in our own spirituality? Of course they do. And these roots are a direct result of the history of generations that have questioned and have been heretical before us. And I will tell you, legacy, as we know from our own dads, can be positive or negative. We might have been raised by parents who really are pretty disappointed that we left the Mothership and became Unitarian Universalists. We know the Mothership is the Catholic ship. Just wanted to let you know, okay? Those of you that left other ones, that's like, you know how you have the big aircraft carrier, and then you have the little destroyers? You're on those little destroyers. Methodists, Episcopalians. Okay, now I would say the Jewish probably is the big ship. Okay, I get that. All right. Our legacy goes back 2,000 years or more. When anyone questioned authority, questioned what was being true, demanded the right of consciousness to believe what they thought was right. You know, that is a legacy of free thinkers, independent minds, heretics opposing orthodoxies that they knew weren't true. That's a legacy that's been given to us. It may not be from our own family, but it's something that attracted us and saying, hey, I want to be part of this history. Now, other church services have many elements that we don't have. You know, they have sacraments. A lot of the independent churches, these big mega churches, have amazing music, youth programs. Coming out of COVID, we're just getting back. And we have our families now. I had a young man that was helping us out last week, and he asked me specifically, he says, is there anyone else my age? And I said, are you 70? That's only a joke for some of you, okay? For the rest of you, we resemble that remark. So anyway, I said, we don't have any 17-year-olds here. But it's something we want to have. So everything happens in its time. And that is our legacy. Coming back, being resilient, being who we are, opening our family program. And he actually wanted to come back this Sunday. He couldn't come back because it's Father's Day, so he's home. But I thought that was very poignant for him to ask that question. And then to say, okay, but I still want to come back. That's fine too. So that's how we start. So there's a legacy. There's something in him that's saying, something that's resonating with me. There's a level of consciousness there. Now, when the King of Hungary said that each community had the right to pick their own religion, it was a monumental shift, the first European country to do that. It was short-lived, but it was a shift that would ultimately enshrine religious freedom in many nations, although still not in every nation today. Intolerance and oppression are also legacies. Many nations still impose religious exclusion or try to reimpose or impose the idea of a state religion. Now, some of these nations are Muslim-centric, where the authorities are very severe in their punishments, even execution of someone trying to convert someone else from the Muslim faith. In the United States, the Pledge of Allegiance added under God in the 1950s as a response to the perceived threat of communism. But now, if you don't want to say these words, even though there's many more years we didn't use those words, you are considered unpatriotic. There's those that want to put the Ten Commandments in every public school. And they say this is a legacy. It is. It's not the legacy that I want, but it's definitely a legacy. There are others that want to officially declare that our nation was founded as a Christian nation. This clearly opposes our founders' wishes. So we became Unitarian Universalists because of our need to question, explore, and embrace truth. We wanted to fight for justice for those who are oppressed and vulnerable and outcast from the mainstream. We live differently here. Now, Sharon Scholl once mentioned to me, she goes, our services sometimes sound like we're at a Rotary Club meeting. And nothing wrong with the Rotary Club. They're wonderful meetings. But, we tend to be a little more laid back, okay? We do not speak in tongues. Doesn't mean we don't have enthusiasm. Doesn't mean we don't love arts and music. Doesn't mean we don't love living. And if someone wants to speak in tongues, I'm okay with that too. I think we all follow our own spiritual truths here, our own spiritual paths. And that's so cool to me. And I know that I tend to use my rational mind a little bit more from my other side. It's there. It just doesn't work as fast. And so the intuitive and the rational, the feminine and the masculine, the forefathers and the foremothers, it's all who we are. What about our legacy? Will we be open enough to the future? Will we be free-flowing with our values, or will we be irrelevant? Can we maintain our Unitarian Universalist principles even if the rough get going? Will we stay the course? Will our children, grandchildren, nieces, nephews, children's friends say, hey, our mom, our dad, our uncle, our friend, they were a little weird. They went to a weird church. But they were cool. And they lived their values. And they taught me to be tolerant. They taught me to vote, to use the democratic process. They taught me that social justice means to protect the vulnerable. And they had a commitment to sustain the earth. And thank you, Mom, Dad, Grandma, Grandpa, Aunt, Uncle, for helping to keep the earth going. That's what I hope our legacy is. We cannot do more. The legacy that we leave is ours, but our children and their children are we going to be responsible for their times and their legacies. If you think artificial intelligence is the next evolution, it's not going to be a problem for most of us in this room, but it is going to be a problem for the next generation. They're going to have to deal with that. We can help them to set an ethical and moral base. So Rumi said about children that they're born with their own compass, that we are the bow, steady in hand of time, but they are the arrows, singing toward a sky that we will never enter. So our task is not aimed, he says, to aim them toward our past, but to release them into the uncharted air. We have to trust for our own children, our legacy, that invisible currents to us will carry them. And so he reminds us, we have to let that string hum with release and let it go. Kids, the next generation are going to stumble. They're going to rise again. They're going to get up. They're going to have dreams that we do not even know exist. They're going to speak languages, particularly with robotics and artificial intelligence, that we will never know with our tongue. That's what we do. So the legacy we live is not tethered. It's love that flows on a wind. And he says, you may stand at the edge of the road watching the future generations dissolve into the morning. But in the quiet of your chest, their footsteps will echo, and in the marrow of your bones, their laughter will keep blooming. For they are not yours to keep, but yours to guide. That's the legacy we leave. We are going to leave a legacy. Whether you were a physician and treated thousands of patients, a caregiver, whether you had one person that you helped to invite to come to this church. This is the legacy we leave. Imperfect, but perhaps the most perfect, because we leave a legacy of love. We, as Unitarian Universalists, understand real, uncompromised, non-judgmental love. Our children, both biological and adopted in life, our children in our RE program, and our community, they will appreciate the legacy we leave because the principles that we have. And I think when I say I love you all, that's a legacy that I have received from you and am able to give back. And so for that legacy, I thank you. Thank you.